There is a question that Carl Jung spent decades circling, never answering directly, yet always returning to. Not whether Jesus existed, not whether he was divine, but something far more unsettling. What if Jesus wasn't only a religious figure, but a psychological event? What if his life, stripped of doctrine, stripped of theology, stripped of everything institutions later built around it, was actually a map of the deepest transformation a human being can undergo? Jung called that transformation individuation, the process by which a fragmented person becomes whole. And in his private writings, the ones rarely taught, rarely discussed, he suggested something radical, something that in another era might have been considered dangerous. He believed that Jesus of Nazareth may have been the first human being in recorded history to fully complete that process, not because he was God, but because of what he was willing to face. Stay with me, because once you see what Jung saw, you won't be able to look at this story the same way again. Before we even approach the life of Jesus, we need to understand what individuation actually means. Because today the word is thrown around casually, often stripped of its depth. In Jung's framework, the human psyche is not a unified system, it's a battlefield. On one side, you have the ego, the conscious self, the version of you that wakes up every morning, goes to work, smiles when needed, and tells the world, "I'm fine." The part that believes it has control. On the other side, there is the unconscious, vast, ancient, and incomprehensible. A hidden world filled with everything the ego has rejected, denied, or buried. Jung gave a name to this rejected territory, the shadow. But the shadow is not just your dark side. It is everything about you that was deemed unacceptable. Your anger, your ambition, your grief, your longing for something deeper that no system could ever fully satisfy. And here's the truth most people never confront. The majority of human lives are spent avoiding the shadow. We project it onto others. We bury it under routines. We construct identities that keep it quiet. We become performers of a life that feels safe but incomplete. Individuation begins the moment you stop running. It is the decision, often forced by suffering, to descend into the unconscious and face what you have avoided your entire life. To meet the shadow directly. To integrate it. And if you survive that process, what emerges is what Jung called the self. Not the ego, not the persona, but the totality of who you actually are beneath every mask you've ever worn. But here's the part people don't like to hear. Most never begin this journey. And those who do, many never finish it. Because this descent is not symbolic, it is not poetic. It is terrifying. It dismantles everything you thought you were. It strips away the identity you spent years building. It asks for something radical, something almost impossible. It asks you to die psychologically before you can be reborn. Jung knew this firsthand. Between 1913 and 1917, during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, he came dangerously close to psychological collapse. What he recorded in the Red Book was not theory. It was lived experience. A man descending into his own inner abyss and fighting his way back. And when he returned, when he finally understood what had happened to him, he began to see something astonishing. He looked at the life of Jesus, Dhamma, and he recognized the pattern, not as theology, not as miracle, but as the same descent, lived openly, publicly, and historically. Jung saw the real beginning of that journey not in the birth narrative, but at the Jordan River, the baptism. In the Gospel of Mark, the earliest and most raw account, the moment Jesus rises from the water is described in violent terms. The heavens don't gently open, they tear apart. And then comes the voice, "You are my Son, the Beloved, with you I am well pleased." Most people interpret this as divine affirmation. Jung saw something else. He saw it as an encounter with what he called the numinous, an overwhelming eruption from the unconscious. A confrontation with something so vast, so powerful, that the only language capable of describing it is the language of the divine. And then something crucial happens. Immediately after this moment, the Spirit drives him into the desert. Not invites, not suggests, drives. This is the language of compulsion, of being seized by something deeper than your will. Anyone who has ever truly begun inner transformation knows this feeling. The sense that your psyche is pulling you somewhere you never planned to go. And in that desert for 40 days, Jesus faces what the Gospels call the adversary. Jung had a deeply unsettling interpretation of this figure. In works like Answer to Job, he suggested that what we call Satan, the adversary, the one who divides, is not merely an external being but a projection of the shadow itself. Even more provocatively, he argued that within the biblical tradition, this adversary represents the unacknowledged, darker aspect of the divine. Psychologically, this moment in the desert is the confrontation with the shadow. Look closely at what is offered. Bread, basic survival, the hunger of the body, power, the fantasy of control over the entire world, and finally the demand to test God, to force reality to prove itself. Each temptation is a deeper question. Who are you, really? Under hunger, under suffering, under uncertainty, what do you truly want? And here is what makes this moment so important. Jesus does not deny these impulses. He does not pretend they aren't there. He faces each one directly. He enters into dialogue with them. And then consciously he chooses differently. This is everything. Because in Jungian psychology, suppression leads to fragmentation, but conscious confrontation leads to transformation. What happens to a human being who survives this? What happens when someone no longer lives from the defended ego, but from an integrated center? Jung had an answer. They become radically free, and that is where the story truly begins. What happens when a human being has passed through the confrontation with the shadow and no longer lives from the fragile defensive ego? According to Carl Jung, something extraordinary begins to emerge. A kind of freedom that is difficult to explain but unmistakable when you see it. Because the ego is always conditioned. It needs approval, it seeks validation. It constantly calculates, how am I being seen? Am I accepted? Do I belong? The ego performs, but the integrated self does not. And when you begin to read the Gospels through this psychological lens, something becomes impossible to ignore. Jesus does not behave like a man managing his image. He does not act like someone trying to gain approval. In fact, he does the opposite. He touches lepers, fully aware that it makes him ritually unclean. He speaks openly with women in public, something deeply transgressive in that culture. He sits and eats with tax collectors, outcasts, and sinners, the very people his society has rejected, labeled, and pushed into the shadows. And here is where Jung's insight becomes almost shocking. Every person that society rejects, Jesus moves toward, not away. Why? Because the one who has integrated their own shadow can no longer project it onto others. Where the unintegrated person sees an enemy, the individuated person sees a human being. This is what Jung called externalized individuation. The inner transformation becomes visible in the way you meet the world. And then there are the teachings themselves. Teachings that, for centuries, have been treated as moral instructions. But Jung saw something deeper. He believed they were not commands. They were descriptions. Descriptions of what life looks like after individuation. Love your enemies. That is not something the ego can do. The ego needs enemies. It defines itself through opposition, through comparison, through separation. But the self does not, because it has already faced what it fears. It has already integrated what it rejects. There is nothing left to project outward. And then there is one of the most misunderstood statements. The kingdom of heaven is within you. In the original Greek, the phrase points not to a distant place, but to a state of consciousness. Not something you reach after death, but something available here, now. Jung believed that what Jesus was describing in the language of a first-century teacher was the same psychological reality he himself was mapping 2,000 years later. The emergence of the self, the unified center. The moment a human being becomes fully human, but then the story takes a darker turn. Because individuation does not end with insight. It deepens, it intensifies, and eventually it demands everything. We arrive at the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before the crucifixion. Jesus withdraws, not just from the crowd, but even from his closest followers. He goes alone, and what happens there is one of the most revealing moments in the entire narrative. According to the Gospel of Luke, His sweat becomes like drops of blood falling to the ground. A rare condition, hematidrosis, where extreme psychological stress causes blood vessels to rupture into the sweat glands. This is not calm. This is not serenity. This is absolute anguish. And then comes the prayer. Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. This is where Jung paused, because this moment breaks every simplistic interpretation. Here is a man who has healed, taught, transformed lives. And now, at the edge of everything, he does not want to go forward. He does not want to suffer. He does not want to die. And Jung saw this not as weakness, but as truth, because the fully individuated person is not someone who has escaped their humanity. It is someone who has gone all the way into it. The ego says, protect yourself, avoid pain, find another way. And for a brief, raw human moment, Jesus agrees, take this cup from me. But then comes the second half of the sentence, the part Jung believed holds the entire structure of transformation. Yet not my will, but yours be done. In psychological terms, not the will of the ego, but the will of the self, not what the conscious mind prefers, but what the deeper integrated center already knows. This is the turning point, not the resurrection, not the miracle. Gethsemane, the moment when a human being, fully aware of the cost, chooses wholeness over survival. Because here is the truth most people avoid. At this point in the journey, you can still turn back. The ego can always retreat. And most people do. They choose comfort. They choose safety. They choose the familiar identity, even if it is incomplete. Jung believed that much of human life is an extended Gethsemane, a quiet, ongoing negotiation, choosing what is easy over what is true, again and again. But in this moment, Jesus does not turn back. He steps forward, and Jung was clear about what comes next. The crucifixion, when seen psychologically, is not just the death of a man. It is the death of the ego, the structure that says, I am separate. I must defend myself. I am in control. And then comes one of the most disturbing, often overlooked moments in the entire story. A sentence that many traditions struggle to fully explain. Oh my God, wait, why have you forsaken me? In Aramaic, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Jung returned to this line again and again, because here everything collapses. No followers, no miracles, no rescue. Even the inner sense of divine presence disappears. This is what Jung described as the dark night of the soul, a term echoed by John of the Cross. The moment between death and rebirth, the void, the place where nothing makes sense, where everything you relied on is gone, and you are left with nothing. Jesus does not bypass this. He does not explain it away. He does not hide it behind spiritual language. He enters it fully. He cries out, and that cry, raw, unfiltered, human, is not failure. It is the final stripping away of illusion, the complete surrender of the ego, and Jung believed this is where most people stop. Where they retreat, where they rebuild the old identity, instead of allowing it to die. But the story doesn't end here, because something comes after this. Something that cannot emerge until everything else has fallen away. What comes after the collapse? After the ego has been stripped away? After the identity you once called yourself no longer holds? This is where Carl Jung became very precise, because he understood something most people miss. The crucifixion is not the end of the process. It is the threshold, a psychological death. Not of the body, but of the structure that says, I am separate, I am in control, I must defend myself at all costs. And when that structure truly dies, not performed, not imagined, but actually surrendered, something begins to emerge that could not exist before. This is where Jung approached the idea of resurrection carefully. He was not a literalist, but he was also not dismissive in the way modern thinking often is. Instead, he made a distinction that changes everything. The difference between historical fact and psychological truth. Whether or not the physical body of Jesus rose, Jung did not claim to prove, but what the resurrection represents psychologically, that he believed is real in the deepest possible sense. Because when the ego dies, something new appears, not the old identity, not its opposite, but something entirely different. In the Gospels, the resurrected Christ is not the same figure who walked before the crucifixion. He appears in locked rooms. He is not always recognized, even by those who knew him best. He eats, yet he is no longer bound in the same way. He is present, but not confined. Jung saw this as the language of experience trying to describe something beyond the ego, the emergence of the self, the integrated whole, a mode of being that is still human, but no longer limited by the fears, defenses, and compulsions of the old identity. And look at how this figure moves. He does not argue. He does not defend a position. He does not try to prove himself. He simply meets people, exactly where they are. Mary alone in the garden, and two travelers on the road, disciples by the sea at dawn. Each encounter is direct, personal, unforced, because the individuated self does not perform. It relates, without armor, without strategy, without the need to control how it is perceived. And then, the ascension, the withdrawal of physical presence. Jung interpreted this not as disappearance but as transformation on another level. The individual life dissolves, but the pattern remains. He believed that the image of Christ became what psychology calls an archetype, a universal pattern embedded in the human unconscious, not tied to one culture, not limited to one time, but accessible to anyone, anywhere, who descends deeply enough into their own psyche. The man dies, the pattern lives, and that pattern continues to guide human beings toward wholeness, not through doctrine, not through belief, but through the structure of the psyche itself. This is where Jung's perspective becomes almost impossible to ignore, because he was not trying to reduce religion to psychology. He was pointing to something far more profound, that at the deepest level, psychology and authentic spiritual experience are mapping the same territory. The descent, the confrontation with the shadow, the death of the false self, the emergence of something real. He believed that Jesus did not just teach this path. He lived it completely, consciously, and publicly. And what was left behind was not a system of beliefs, but a map that has been in front of humanity for over 2,000 years. And yet, most people never take the first step, because the cost is too high. To begin this process means facing what you've avoided. It means questioning the identity you've built. It means stepping into uncertainty without guarantees. And so instead, people manage, they perform, they survive, they live lives that never fully become what they could be. Jung warned about this more than anything else. He said the greatest danger is not failure. It is an unlived life, a life where you never descend, never confront what is actually there, never discover who you are beneath the masks. And so the real question, the one Jung would ask, is not theoretical. It is immediate. Where are you in this process? Are you still in the desert, negotiating with the shadow, offering it small compromises, hoping it will leave you alone? Are you in your own Gethsemane, knowing what must be done, feeling the weight of it, still wishing there was another way? Or have you already gone through the collapse, standing in the ruins of who you used to be, not yet realizing that what comes next is not the end, but the beginning of something that was never possible before? This is not a story about the past. It is a mirror, and the map is still here. The only question is, will you follow it?